Howdy everyone. So what I have done so far, I had the wheel and tire assembly mounted on the axle, and like I had talked about before, the heavy washer that goes back here, you want that to be nice and dry. Put the wheel and tire on. The other washer that you put on after the tire assembly and wheel assembly is in place, the back side of that washer that rests on the rubber seal that's on the wheel itself, you want that to be nice and dry. But then the top face of the washer, you want a little bit of grease on that because that's what the nut, the axle nut, is actually going to spin against. So you want a little bit of lubricant on that. Again, you want your washers and your black seals on your bearings, you want those nice and dry, because you do not want those to spin on the axle. You want the wheel to spin around those rubber seals. So the rubber seals, the washers, you don't want those to rotate. So I had that assembly together, and I tightened the nut by hand, spin the tire back and forth a few times, tighten it some more, back and forth, tighten it some more. I kept doing that until the rubber seals no longer spun. And then I just kept tightening it by hand and spinning the wheel until I was comfortable with the amount of drag on the wheel. After I had done that, I used this backing plate for orientation, right? So this is basically parallel to the ground when the landing gear is actually on the airplane, give or take, right? So using this as my up reference, after I had the nut tight and the drag on the wheel the way that I liked it, I chose a hole. Where'd the nut go? Hello. So I chose a hole. Here's the nut. You can see it's pre-drilled on every flat. I obviously chose a hole on the nuts that was as close as I could get to vertical when the landing gear is in the correct orientation on the airplane, so that the cotter pin is always basically, gravity is pulling it down into the axle. So I chose the appropriate flat, put a drill bit through that hole, pre-drilled slightly into the axle. Then I came from the other end through the other hole in the opposite flat, pre-drilled a little bit into the axle. And then of course I took that assembly apart. I got some tape in place to prevent these shavings from getting into here. And now I am just drilling the hole through one side of the axle with a tiny drill bit, and then I come back through the opposite side of the axle with a tiny drill bit. I keep working my way up on both sides till I get to an eighth, and then I'll run that eighth inch drill all the way through from one side, and I'll run it all the way through from the other side. At that point, I clean everything really good, and you need to clean everything really good. You need to make sure these shavings are out of the threads. There's no shavings down in the axle. There aren't any shavings in here. You don't want any shavings in your brake bosses. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you don't get any shavings in or around the black rubber seals on the wheel assemblies and things of that nature. So clean, clean, clean. And then it's just a matter of putting the assembly back together, spinning your nut back on till the holes line up, check the drag on the tire. When your holes lined up, you can drop in your cotter pin. Now, the first wheel assembly that I did, when I came back and put the nut on and had it in place, I couldn't get the cotter pin in. I'd back it off a hole, and it went in a little bit nicer, but the drag on the wheel was too loose. So then I went to the next flat. That one didn't seem to want to go in, and of course the flat after that didn't even want to start. So I ended up match drilling, if you will, the nut and the axle as an assembly. Just a simple match drill using a 12-inch drill bit right through the whole thing. And then I was able to drop my cotter pin in. And the drag on the wheel is really nice. So before I drilled this one, I made note of the drag on that other wheel assembly, and I tried to match it when I had tightened the nut down on this assembly. Again, making sure that the rubber seal was not spinning. So Between this axle and the other axle, once I get it completely finished, the drag on both tires should be roughly the same. And that's just by hand. That's just a feel by hand. So I'm going to clean this up, clean off the shavings, clean everything really nice, clean the wheel assembly really nice, make sure there are no shavings anywhere, make sure that this bare metal is greased, make sure the threads are clean. Put everything back together and see what happens with the cotter pin and see how the drag feels. Howdy everyone. Alright, so I'm moving on with this engine mount main gear assembly and attaching it to the fuselage. Prior to doing that, however, since I'm using the piano hinge method to attach my cowling, I want to rivet the side hinges that are going to go here. I want to rivet those in place before I bolt on the engine mount. Once the engine mount's in place, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to rivet these with the hinge. So I'm going to do that first. So all I had done so far, I had brought my lower cowling over and I held my lower cowling in place up against the firewall. The very top edge of the bottom cowling is represented by this very little black mark right above my finger, right here. That represents the very top of the bottom cowling. Now when you look at the plans for these side hinges, they tell you to stop prior to the curve. Well, the curve is way down here in this corner, just before you get to your gear leg cutout. And I've already got a rivet here, which is part of this string of rivets that run along the fuselage side skin. So my hinge, I've decided, is going to make use of this hole here and run all the way up to this hole here. So again, the top of the bottom cowling is represented by this line. I've got this hole here, which is way too close to this line to make any use of. So my hinge is going to stop at this cleco. So what I may end up having is these clecos, these holes will all be riveted to a hinge. This will just be a standard rivet with no hinge. And then the other hinge may start somewhere up here. So this hole and maybe a couple others won't be attached to any hinge. I'm not worried about these. I just want to get this side hinge in so I can work on my engine mount. So that's what I'm going to do. I've got this rivet here already in place, which is part of this run of rivets. The very next one up, I'm going to make from there to the hole below the line of my cowling mark. That's where my hinge is going to stop. So when I take a measurement, when you take into consideration edge distance, so you know your hole is going to be here where this cleco is, you want to go beyond that for edge distance. Same at the bottom. You know that your hole is going to be here. You want to go beyond that for edge distance. So including your edge distance at both ends, you take that measurement, and that came out to be about 14.5 inches. And then when you come over to your hinge, let me get this together. When you come over to your hinge, you don't want to cut through a knuckle if you can help it. So I just did the 14.5 inches and I went to the nearest, if you will, full knuckle at each end. And it ended up being 14.5 inches. Go figure. Probably because these are 1/2 inch wide knuckles. So anyway, now that I've got my hinges cut, and of course, like I said, you do not want to cut through the middle of a knuckle if you can help it. In this case, you can help it because you're making these from scratch. They're not pre-drilled or anything. So now I've got my two hinges cut to length, one for each side of the fuselage. I'm going to clean these up, deburr them, and then I'm going to start laying out the holes. And and try to get them riveted onto the sides. So let me work on some deburring and whatnot here. I'll talk to you guys here in a second.